In the summer of 1867, Clara Hartwell's gift for healing made her the most feared woman in Millbrook, Kansas, until a mysterious stranger arrived who saw past the town's accusations of witchcraft to discover the true heart of a woman whose only crime was saving lives. But when a mob gathers outside her cabin with torches blazing, will one man's belief in her innocence be enough to save them both from the flames of ignorance? The rooster's crow pierced the Kansas morning air like a knife through silk, but Clara Hartwell was already awake, her hands working by candlelight to grind dried willow bark into powder. The summer of 1867 had brought fierce heat to the prairie town of Millbrook, and with it came the kinds of sickness that made mothers weep and fathers pace their porches all night long. Clara's small cabin sat on the edge of town like a forgotten prayer, surrounded by rows of herbs that most folks couldn't name but had learned to respect. Her fingers moved with the skill of 20 years spent catching babies and mending broken bones. The mortar and pestle made a steady rhythm against the wooden table her father had built before the fever took him. Outside her window, the first hints of golden light stretched across the endless grass, painting everything in shades of hope and worry mixed together. Clara paused to wipe sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of herb dust across her skin. At 35, she had delivered half the children in Millbrook and buried too many of their grandparents. Her brown hair, streaked with early gray, was pulled back in a simple bun that had come loose during the night's work. She wore a plain blue dress, practical and sturdy, with pockets deep enough to hold the small bottles and cloth pouches that were her tools of trade. The smell of brewing coffee mixed with the sharp scent of medicinal plants. Clara had learned to make her morning drink strong and black, knowing that sleep was a luxury she couldn't always afford. Somewhere in town, someone might be fighting for their life, and she would be the one they called when hope seemed lost. She moved to her collection of glass jars, each one carefully labeled in her neat handwriting. Echinacea for infections, chamomile for troubled stomachs, and elderflower for the kind of fever that made children talk to people who weren't there. Her grandmother had taught her the old ways, the knowledge that came from watching and learning, and remembering what worked when nothing else would. The wooden floorboards creaked under her feet as she packed her leather bag with fresh supplies. Inside went clean cloth strips, a small sharp knife, 3 different kinds of healing powders, and a bottle of the strongest medicine she knew how to make. The bag had been her grandmother's, and before that, her great-grandmother's. Its worn leather held the smell of countless herbs and the weight of generations of healing hands. Clara stepped outside to check her garden, where rows of green plants grew in neat lines despite the dry summer heat. She had learned to read the signs in their leaves, which ones were ready to harvest, which ones needed more water, and which ones held the power to pull someone back from the edge of death. The morning air was already warm, promising another day of scorching heat that would test both plants and people. As she knelt to water her feverfew plants, Clara heard the distant sound of church bells calling the faithful to morning prayer. She had stopped attending services months ago, after Reverend Blackwood's sermon about unnatural healing and powers that belong to God alone. The words had stung more than she wanted to admit. But Clara had learned to find her prayers in the work of her hands rather than the words of men who had never held a dying child. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the sounds of Millbrook waking up. Hammers rang from the blacksmith shop, wheels creaked as wagons rolled down the dusty main street, and somewhere a baby cried with a healthy wail that meant all was well. Clara allowed herself a small smile, remembering the night 2 weeks ago when she had helped that same baby take his first breath. She was measuring dried mint leaves when the sound reached her, footsteps running fast across the hard-packed earth, getting closer with each heartbeat. Clara looked up to see a figure approaching through the morning haze, moving with the desperate speed that meant trouble had found someone in Millbrook once again. The footsteps belonged to a woman, Clara realized, and as the figure drew closer, she recognized the familiar shape of Margaret Donnelly, the blacksmith's wife. But something was wrong with the way Margaret was moving, stumbling and weaving like someone who had forgotten how to walk properly. Clara dropped her measuring spoon and hurried toward the door, her heart already beginning to race with the knowledge that whatever brought Margaret Donnelly running at this hour would test every skill she possessed. Margaret Donnelly burst through Clara's door like a storm wind, her face streaked with tears and her Sunday dress torn at the sleeve. In her arms, she carried a bundle that made Clara's blood run cold. Her 3-year-old son Billy, his small body limp and burning with fever so intense that Clara could feel the heat radiating from him even as Margaret stumbled forward. "Please," Margaret gasped, her voice cracking like dried leather. "Please, Clara. I don't know what else to do. He's been like this since midnight, and Doc Morrison rode out to the Hendricks Ranch yesterday. Won't be back till tomorrow. Maybe longer." She swayed on her feet, exhaustion and fear written in every line of her body. "I've tried everything I know. Cold water, prayers, even wrapped him in wet sheets like my mother used to do. Nothing works." Clara's hands were already reaching for the child before Margaret finished speaking. Billy's skin was flushed deep red, the color of danger that every mother feared. His breathing came in short, rapid gasps that reminded Clara of a bird with a broken wing. When she touched his forehead, the heat nearly burned her palm. This was no ordinary fever. This was the kind of sickness that could steal a child's life before the sun set again. "How long has he been this way?" Clara asked, carrying Billy to her bed and laying him gently on the clean white sheets. Her voice stayed calm and steady, though her heart was hammering like a blacksmith's anvil. She had seen this before, too many times, and knew that the next few hours would determine whether Billy Donnelly would live to see his 4th birthday. "Started yesterday evening," Margaret said, wringing her hands until her knuckles went white. "Just a little cough at first, nothing to worry about, but then he wouldn't eat his supper, and by bedtime he was burning up. I sat with him all night, but he kept getting worse. This morning he couldn't even tell me his name." Her voice broke completely on the last words. And Clara saw the terror that lived in every mother's heart, the fear of losing the most precious thing in the world. Clara's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking Billy's pulse, listening to his breathing, and examining his throat for the telltale signs that would tell her what they were fighting. The child's heartbeat was racing like a trapped rabbit's, and when she pressed her ear to his chest, she could hear the rattle that meant his lungs were filling with fluid. Scarlet fever, she realized, with a sinking heart. The same disease that had taken 3 children in the past month. "I need you to help me," Clara said, turning to Margaret with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of facing life and death decisions. "Can you do that? Can you be strong for Billy?" Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Good. First, I need you to get me the large pot from the kitchen and fill it with water. We're going to make him a bath that will help bring down the fever." While Margaret hurried to follow her instructions, Clara moved to her medicine cabinet and began selecting the tools she would need for the battle ahead. Willow bark for the fever, elderflower to help him sweat out the poison, and a special mixture her grandmother had taught her for when a child's life hung by a thread. She measured each ingredient with the precision of someone who knew that too little might not work, but too much could be just as dangerous. "The water's ready," Margaret called from the kitchen, her voice tight with controlled panic. Clara carried Billy to the large wooden tub, his small body so hot that steam rose from the cool water when she lowered him in. At first, he didn't react at all, but slowly, his breathing began to ease just a little. Margaret knelt beside the tub, her hands shaking as she helped support her son's head. "Now comes the hard part," Clara said, mixing her medicines in a small cup. "I need to get this into him, but he might fight it. The fever makes children confused and scared. You'll need to hold him steady while I work." The liquid in the cup was bitter and strong, made from plants that could heal or harm depending on how they were used. Clara had learned long ago that the most powerful medicines often tasted the worst. For the next hour, Clara worked with the focus of someone who understood that every minute counted. She spooned medicine into Billy's mouth, applied cool cloths to his forehead, and watched for any sign that the fever was breaking. Margaret stayed by her side, following every instruction without question, her love for her son giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. As the morning sun climbed higher, Billy's breathing slowly became less labored. The dangerous red flush began to fade from his cheeks, replaced by a more natural color that made both women dare to hope. Clara continued her careful work, adjusting the temperature of his bath, administering medicine at precise intervals, and monitoring every change in his condition. "Is he going to be all right?" Margaret whispered, afraid to speak too loudly in case it might somehow make things worse. Clara looked at the child in the tub, noting the way his breathing had steadied and how his pulse had slowed to a more normal rhythm. The fever was still there, but it no longer felt like a fire that might consume him. "The worst is over," Clara said quietly, "but he's not out of danger yet. We need to keep working." She looked at Margaret's exhausted face and made a decision that would change everything. "You should go home and rest. I'll stay with him. Come back this evening and bring some of his favorite foods. If I'm right, he'll be hungry by then." Margaret hesitated, torn between her need to stay with her son and her trust in Clara's skill. Finally, she nodded and kissed Billy's forehead gently. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what we would have done without you." As she left, Clara settled in for what she knew would be a long vigil, unaware that word of her latest miracle was already beginning to spread through the streets of Millbrook. Billy Donnelly's laughter echoed through Clara's cabin like music she had forgotten existed, filling the small space with joy that seemed impossible just 3 days earlier. The boy sat cross-legged on her kitchen floor, playing with wooden blocks while his mother watched from the doorway, tears of relief streaming down her face. Clara stood at her stove, stirring a pot of chicken soup that smelled like hope and tasted like victory over death itself. "Mama, look!" Billy called out, stacking his blocks into a wobbly tower. "I made it tall as me." His voice was clear and strong, with no trace of the rattling cough that had nearly stolen his breath forever. The dangerous red flush had disappeared from his cheeks, replaced by the healthy pink glow of a child who had beaten the fever and lived to play another day. Clara smiled as she ladled soup into a small bowl, adding a piece of fresh bread that Margaret had brought from the bakery. The boy's appetite had returned with startling speed, and he had already eaten more in one morning than most sick children managed in a week. His recovery was the kind that made people whisper about miracles, though Clara knew it was simply the result of the right medicine given at the right time by hands that refused to give up. "How did you know what to do?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with wonder and gratitude. "Doc Morrison always just gives laudanum and tells us to pray. But you fought that fever like you could see it with your own eyes." She shook her head in amazement. "Billy was so close to. I thought we were going to lose him." Clara handed the bowl to Billy, who accepted it with the enthusiasm of someone who had rediscovered the joy of being alive. "My grandmother taught me that fever isn't the enemy," she explained, sitting down beside them. "It's the body's way of fighting off sickness, but sometimes it fights so hard that it can hurt the person it's trying to protect. The trick is knowing how to help it win without letting it burn everything down." The afternoon passed peacefully, with Billy's strength returning more with each passing hour. Clara watched him play, marveling at the resilience of children and the way they could bounce back from the edge of death as if nothing had happened. She had seen this recovery pattern before, but it never failed to fill her with a deep sense of satisfaction that made all the sleepless nights and worried hours worthwhile. As the sun began to set, Margaret gathered her son's few belongings and prepared to take him home. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, pressing a small cloth bag into Clara's hands. "It's not much, but it's everything we can spare right now." Clara opened the bag to find a handful of coins and a small silver locket that had clearly been in Margaret's family for generations. "This is too much," Clara protested, trying to return the locket. "Seeing Billy healthy again is payment enough." But Margaret closed Clara's fingers around the precious item, her eyes shining with tears of gratitude. "Please," she whispered. "My mother gave this to me when I got married. She said it would protect my family. Now I want you to have it, because you're the one who actually did the protecting." After they left, Clara sat alone in her cabin, holding the locket and feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being the person people turned to when hope seemed lost. The silver was warm from Margaret's touch, and inside was a tiny picture of a woman who looked remarkably like Billy's mother. Clara fastened the chain around her neck, touched by the trust and love that had prompted such a generous gift. But as the evening deepened, Clara began to notice sounds that made her stomach tighten with unease. Voices carried on the night air, hushed conversations that seemed to pause when she moved near her window. She caught fragments of words, unnatural, too fast. No regular medicine works like that. That made her realize the miracle of Billy's recovery was being viewed through a darker lens by some of her neighbors. The next morning brought visitors Clara hadn't expected. 3 women from the church auxiliary stood on her doorstep. Their faces, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that made Clara's heart sink. Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, stepped forward as their spokesperson, her voice carefully neutral in the way that meant trouble was brewing beneath the surface. "We heard about the Donnelly boy," she said, her pale eyes studying Clara's face for signs of, "What? Guilt? Supernatural powers? Such a remarkable recovery. Almost unprecedented, one might say." The other women nodded in agreement, their expressions suggesting that unprecedented was not necessarily a good thing in their minds. Clara invited them in, serving tea and trying to ignore the way they examined her herb jars and medical supplies with the intensity of people looking for evidence of wrongdoing. She explained Billy's treatment in simple terms, describing each medicine she had used and why it had been effective. But with each explanation, the women's expressions grew more skeptical rather than more understanding. "You see," Mrs. Patterson said finally, setting down her teacup with a decisive clink, "that's what concerns us. Doc Morrison has been practicing medicine for 15 years, and he's never seen a child recover from scarlet fever so quickly. It makes one wonder if there might be other factors at work." The way she said "other factors" made Clara's blood run cold with understanding. After the women left, Clara found herself pacing her small cabin like a caged animal, the joy of Billy's recovery now tainted by the realization that her success might become her downfall. She had always known that her skills made some people uncomfortable, but she had never imagined that saving a child's life could be twisted into something dark and threatening. As night fell, Clara heard more voices outside her cabin, hushed conversations that seemed to circle her home like wolves around a campfire. She pulled her curtains closed and tried to focus on preparing medicines for the next day, but her hands shook as she worked. The locket around her neck felt heavier now, not like a gift of gratitude, but like a target that marked her as someone who possessed powers that others couldn't understand or control. The morning sun had barely touched the streets of Millbrook when Clara discovered that her world had shifted overnight like sand in a windstorm. She stepped outside to tend her garden and found Mrs. Henderson from the general store hurrying past with her 2 young daughters, their usual friendly waves replaced by nervous glances and hurried steps that spoke louder than any words could have. Clara's heart sank as she watched the woman pull her children closer, whispering something that made them both turn to stare at her with wide, frightened eyes. The oldest girl, Emma, had always loved Clara's herb garden and would often stop to ask questions about the different plants. Now she hid behind her mother's skirts like Clara had suddenly become something dangerous and unpredictable. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Clara called out, forcing her voice to sound normal and cheerful. "How is little Mary's cough? Is the honey and ginger mixture helping?" But instead of stopping to chat as she usually did, Mrs. Henderson quickened her pace, mumbling something about being late for church and hurrying away as if Clara's very presence might contaminate her family. The rejection stung worse than a wasp, leaving Clara standing alone in her garden with the bitter taste of understanding filling her mouth. She had seen this pattern before in other towns, other times, when fear grew faster than weeds and spread just as quickly from person to person. But she had never imagined it would happen in Millbrook, where she had spent 5 years building trust and helping families through their darkest moments. As Clara worked among her plants, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of tending and harvesting, she noticed how empty the street had become. Usually, children played in the dust while their mothers hung laundry and discussed the day's gossip. Now the road stretched before her house like a river that no one dared to cross, dividing her world from theirs with invisible but powerful barriers. The silence was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps, and Clara looked up hopefully, thinking that perhaps someone had come to ask for her help or simply to offer a friendly word. Instead, she saw Reverend Blackwood walking toward her with the measured steps of a man carrying important news. His black suit and serious expression made him look like a crow bringing messages of doom. "Miss Hartwell," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated politeness, "I trust you're well this morning?" His voice carried the careful tone that ministers used when they were about to deliver uncomfortable truths. Clara set down her watering can and faced him directly, knowing that whatever he had come to say would not be pleasant to hear. "I'm quite well, Reverend," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the way her heart had begun to race. "Is there something I can help you with today?" She hoped he might need medicine for someone in his congregation, but the expression on his face suggested that healing was not what had brought him to her door. Reverend Blackwood cleared his throat in the way that men did when they were about to say something they believed was important and necessary. "I've come to speak with you about the Donnelly boy's recovery," he said, his pale eyes studying her face with uncomfortable intensity. "The speed of his healing has raised questions among some of our congregation, questions that I feel need to be addressed." Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever people questioned her methods, but she forced herself to remain calm and reasonable. "Billy was very sick," she said simply. "I used the same herbs and treatments that I've always used. His recovery was remarkable, but not impossible. Sometimes the body heals faster than we expect." "Indeed," Reverend Blackwood said, but his tone suggested that he found her explanation insufficient. "However, several members of our community have expressed concern about the unusual nature of your healing methods. They wonder if perhaps your success comes from sources that are not entirely natural." The way he paused before the word natural made Clara's stomach clench with dread. "I use plants that grow from God's earth," Clara said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "I learned from my grandmother, who learned from her grandmother before her. There's nothing unnatural about using willow bark for fever or elderflower for congestion. These are gifts from nature, not dark magic." She hoped that explaining her methods would ease his concerns, but his expression remained skeptical. Reverend Blackwood nodded slowly, as if he were considering her words carefully. "I'm sure you believe that," he said finally. "But you must understand that when a child recovers from scarlet fever in 3 days, when other children have died from the same disease despite Dr. Morrison's best efforts, people begin to wonder. They ask themselves what power could accomplish such a thing." His voice dropped to a whisper, "and some of them reach troubling conclusions." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Reverend Blackwood speaking in circles around accusations he was too careful to make directly. Clara answered each veiled question with patience and honesty, but she could see that her words were falling on deaf ears. The minister had already made up his mind about her, and no amount of explanation would change his opinion. After he left, Clara sat on her front steps and watched the sun climb higher in the sky, feeling more alone than she had since her grandmother's death. The locket around her neck felt cold against her skin, a reminder of the gratitude that had briefly brightened her world before fear had swept it away like dust in the wind. As the day wore on, Clara noticed more signs of the town's changing attitude toward her. The baker's delivery boy, who usually stopped to chat and accept a cool drink of water, hurried past without making eye contact. Mrs. Coleman, whose difficult pregnancy Clara had helped 6 months earlier, crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Clara approaching. Even the friendly stray dog that often visited her garden seemed to sense the tension and stayed away. By evening, Clara realized that she had become an island in the middle of her own community, surrounded by suspicion and fear instead of the trust and respect she had worked so hard to earn. She prepared her dinner in silence. The taste of her food turned bitter by the knowledge that tomorrow would likely bring more of the same cold treatment. Outside her window, Millbrook continued its daily life, but Clara was no longer part of it. A dust cloud on the horizon caught Clara's attention as she hung her washing on the line behind her cabin, the sight of an approaching wagon breaking the monotony of another lonely morning in Millbrook. The wooden wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they rolled closer, pulled by two sturdy horses that looked like they had traveled many miles under the summer sun. Clara shaded her eyes with her hand, curious about this stranger, who seemed to be heading directly toward her isolated home. The wagon driver was a man she had never seen before, with weathered hands and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of squinting into prairie sunlight. His brown hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his clothes were the practical sort worn by someone who made his living on the frontier roads. As he pulled his horses to a stop near her gate, Clara noticed that his wagon was loaded with supplies, barrels of flour, bolts of fabric, and wooden crates that suggested he was a traveling merchant. "Good morning, ma'am," he called out, tipping his hat with the easy politeness of someone accustomed to meeting strangers. "I'm Daniel Reeves, and I'm wondering if you might be Clara Hartwell. I've heard quite a bit about you during my travels, and I was hoping we might have a word." His voice carried a warmth that Clara hadn't heard directed toward her in days, and she found herself walking toward the wagon despite her recent caution around unfamiliar visitors. Clara studied his face, searching for signs of the suspicion or fear that had become so common in her interactions with people. Instead, she saw genuine interest and what appeared to be respect, emotions that seemed as foreign to her now as speaking a different language. "I am Clara Hartwell," she said carefully. "What brings you to Millbrook, Mr. Reeves?" Daniel climbed down from his wagon with the easy grace of someone who had spent countless hours traveling rough roads. "I carry goods between settlements," he explained, gesturing toward his loaded wagon. "But I also carry news and stories, and lately, I've been hearing remarkable things about a healer in Millbrook who saved a child's life with her skill and knowledge." He paused, studying her face with curious eyes. "The way people tell it, you worked a miracle." Clara felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. It had been so long since someone had spoken of her work, with admiration rather than suspicion, that she had almost forgotten how good it felt to be appreciated. "I just used what my grandmother taught me," she said modestly. "Billy Donnelly was very sick, but with the right treatment, children can recover from almost anything." "That's exactly what I hope to hear," Daniel said, his smile broadening. "You see, I've traveled through dozens of towns, and I've met many healers along the way. Some are skilled, some are not, but very few have the kind of reputation that reaches 3 counties away." He reached into his wagon and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I brought you something as a token of respect for your work." Clara accepted the bundle with trembling hands, unwrapping it to reveal a collection of seeds she had never seen before. "These are from a Cherokee woman I met in Oklahoma Territory," Daniel explained. "She said they're for a plant that helps with pain better than anything else she knows. I thought someone with your skills might appreciate them." Clara held the seeds like precious jewels, touched by the thoughtfulness of a gift from someone who truly understood her calling. As they talked, Clara found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in weeks. Daniel asked intelligent questions about her methods, listened to her explanations with genuine interest, and shared stories of other healers he had encountered during his travels. For the first time since Billy's recovery, Clara felt like she was talking to someone who saw her as a person rather than a threat or a curiosity. "I have to say," Daniel said after she had shown him through her garden and explained the properties of various plants, "it's refreshing to meet someone who approaches healing with such scientific thinking. Too many people rely on superstition and fear instead of observation and knowledge." His words were like cool water on a hot day, soothing the wounds that recent criticism had opened in Clara's heart. They spent the afternoon talking, with Daniel sharing news from other settlements and Clara describing some of her more challenging cases. She found herself laughing for the first time in days, her spirits lifted by the simple pleasure of intelligent conversation with someone who respected her work. When Daniel mentioned that he would be staying in town for several days while conducting business, Clara felt a flutter of anticipation that surprised her with its intensity. As evening approached, Daniel prepared to drive his wagon into town to find lodging for the night. "I hope you won't mind if I visit again tomorrow," he said, climbing back onto his wagon seat. "I'd like to hear more about your grandmother's teachings. And I have some stories about frontier medicine that might interest you," Clara agreed eagerly. already looking forward to continuing their conversation. After Daniel left, Clara sat on her front steps and watched the sun set over the prairie, feeling more hopeful than she had in weeks. The seeds he had given her lay carefully wrapped in her lap, a tangible reminder that there were still people in the world who valued knowledge and skill over fear and superstition. For the first time since the whispers had started, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future where her work would be appreciated rather than feared. But as darkness settled over Millbrook, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel's arrival had been noticed by others in town. She had seen curtains twitch in windows as his wagon passed, and she wondered what conclusions people would draw about a stranger who seemed so comfortable visiting the woman they had begun to fear. The thought made her stomach tighten with worry, but she pushed the concern aside, determined to enjoy this rare moment of connection and understanding. That night, Clara slept better than she had in weeks, her dreams filled with images of flourishing gardens and grateful families, rather than the nightmares of accusation and exile that had been haunting her rest. The seeds from Daniel's Cherokee friend sat on her bedside table, a symbol of hope and the possibility that her isolated world might be about to expand in ways she had never imagined possible. Daniel Reeves returned to Clara's cabin the next morning carrying a bouquet of wildflowers that seemed to capture all the colors of the prairie summer, their bright petals still damp with dew from the early morning fields. Clara opened her door to find him standing on her threshold, with a smile that made her heart skip in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. His gesture so simple yet so meaningful, after days of cold shoulders and suspicious glances from her neighbors. "I thought your garden could use some company," he said, offering the flowers with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted that his gift would be welcome. "These were growing wild by the creek, and they reminded me of you. Beautiful, strong, and thriving despite difficult conditions." Clara accepted the bouquet with hands that trembled slightly, touched by his kindness and the way he saw beauty in her isolated situation. They spent the morning walking through her expanded herb garden, with Clara explaining the properties of each plant while Daniel asked thoughtful questions that showed he truly understood the science behind her healing methods. Unlike the suspicious visitors who had come before, Daniel seemed genuinely fascinated by her knowledge, rather than threatened by it. And Clara found herself sharing details about her work that she had never discussed with anyone before. "You know," Daniel said as they paused beside a patch of feverfew, "I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday, about how people in town have been treating you since Billy's recovery. It reminds me of something I witnessed in a settlement near Denver last year." He leaned against her garden fence, his expression growing serious. "There was a woman there, a midwife like you, who helped deliver a baby during a difficult birth. The child lived, but because the delivery was so unusual, people started whispering about witchcraft." Clara's hands stilled on the plant she had been examining, her attention fully focused on Daniel's words. "What happened to her?" she asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Stories like these rarely ended well for women who possessed skills that others couldn't understand or explain. "She left town in the middle of the night," Daniel said, his voice heavy with regret, "packed up everything she could carry and disappeared before the fear could turn into something worse. I heard later that she settled in California, but she never practiced midwifery again." Too afraid of what might happen if people started talking, he looked at Clara with eyes that seemed to see straight into her heart. "I'd hate to see the same thing happen to you." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they moved inside for lunch, but Clara couldn't shake the image of another healer forced to abandon her calling because of fear and superstition. She watched Daniel as he examined her collection of medical journals, noting the way he handled each book with respect and genuine interest. His presence in her cabin felt natural and right, as if he belonged in her world of healing herbs and careful knowledge. "I have a confession to make," Daniel said, as they shared a simple meal of bread and soup. "I didn't just happen to hear about you during my travels. I specifically asked about you after someone in the next county mentioned a skilled healer in Millbrook. I wanted to meet the woman who could save a child's life when the town doctor couldn't." He paused, studying her face. "I've been searching for someone like you." Clara's heart began to race, though she wasn't sure if it was from excitement or fear. "Searching for me? Why?" she asked, setting down her spoon with hands that had begun to shake. Daniel's expression grew earnest, and she could see that whatever he was about to say would change something fundamental between them. "Because I believe that knowledge like yours shouldn't be hidden away or feared," he said simply. "I've been working with other traveling merchants to create a network of healers across the frontier. We share information, trade rare medicines, and help each other when communities become difficult." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I think you could be part of something bigger than just helping people in Millbrook." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Clara had never imagined that her isolated work could connect her to other healers across the vast frontier, but the possibility of sharing knowledge and learning from others filled her with excitement. At the same time, the thought of leaving Millbrook, the only home she had ever known, made her stomach clench with uncertainty. "I don't know," she said honestly. "This is my home. My grandmother is buried here, and I've spent 5 years building relationships with families who need my help. How can I just abandon them because some people are afraid of what they don't understand?" The conflict between her desire for connection and her sense of duty created a tension that made her feel pulled in 2 directions at once. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "I'm not asking you to leave," he said. "I'm asking you to consider that you might not have to face this alone. There are others like you, and together we're stronger than we are separately." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her. "This is a letter from a woman in Colorado who uses many of the same techniques you do. She's been helping to organize healers throughout the territory." Clara unfolded the letter and read words that seemed to speak directly to her heart. The woman, whose name was Elizabeth, wrote about the challenges of practicing healing in frontier communities and the importance of supporting each other through difficult times. She mentioned a gathering planned for the following spring, where healers could share knowledge and strengthen their connections across the vast distances of the American West. As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself imagining possibilities she had never considered before. The idea of corresponding with other healers, learning new techniques, and perhaps even attending the gathering Elizabeth mentioned, filled her with a sense of purpose that went beyond her work in Millbrook. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she was looking toward a future that held promise rather than just more isolation and fear. When Daniel prepared to leave that evening, Clara walked him to his wagon with a lighter heart than she had carried in days. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the flowers, for the conversation, and for helping me remember that I'm not alone in this world." Daniel's smile was warm and genuine as he climbed onto his wagon seat. "I'll be in town for 3 more days," he said. "I hope we can continue our conversations." "And Clara?" He paused, looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "I think you're remarkable, and I hope you never let anyone convince you otherwise." As his wagon rolled away into the gathering dusk, Clara stood in her garden holding Elizabeth's letter, feeling like a door had opened to possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The crash of breaking glass shattered the peaceful morning quiet as a rock smashed through Clara's kitchen window, sending sharp fragments flying across her breakfast table like deadly rain. She jumped back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at the jagged hole that now let in the cool morning air, along with something far more dangerous, the unmistakable message that her troubles in Millbrook had taken a violent turn. Clara's hands shook as she picked up the rock, noting how it had been carefully selected for its size and weight, large enough to cause real damage, but small enough for someone to throw accurately from the road. Wrapped around it was a piece of paper tied with string, and as she unfolded it with trembling fingers, she read words that made her blood run cold. "Leave town, witch, or next time we won't miss." The handwriting was disguised, but Clara recognized the cheap paper that came from Henderson's general store, which meant someone she knew, someone she had probably helped at some point, had taken the time to plan this attack. She sank into her chair, still holding the threatening note, as the reality of her situation hit her with crushing force. This wasn't just about whispers and cold shoulders anymore. Someone in Millbrook actually wanted to hurt her. Outside, she could hear the sound of approaching footsteps, and Clara's first instinct was to hide, to pretend she wasn't home, and hope whoever was coming would go away. But then she heard Daniel's familiar voice calling her name, and she realized that his daily visits had become so regular that people would naturally assume he was connected to whatever had happened at her cabin. "Clara!" Daniel's voice carried urgent concern as he saw the broken window. "Are you all right?" I heard the sound of breaking glass from the road. He rushed to her side, his eyes taking in the scattered fragments and the rock still clutched in her hand. When he saw the note, his face darkened with an anger that Clara had never seen before. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Whoever did this isn't just expressing disapproval. They're making threats." He moved to the window and examined the damage, his merchant's eye calculating the cost of replacement glass in a town where such things had to be ordered from distant suppliers. "We need to report this to the sheriff." Clara shook her head, already imagining how that conversation would go. "Sheriff Morrison is Hayes Morrison's brother," she said wearily. "He's not going to take the side of the woman half the town thinks is a witch, against respectable citizens who are just concerned about their community." She had learned long ago that justice often depended more on social standing than on right and wrong, especially for women who lived on the margins of society. As they worked together to clean up the broken glass, Clara found herself watching Daniel's face for signs that this latest development might be too much for him to handle. She had grown accustomed to his visits, looked forward to them more than she cared to admit, and the thought of losing his friendship because of the dangers that seemed to follow her everywhere made her chest tight with anxiety. "I should go," Daniel said suddenly, and Clara's heart sank as she realized her fears were coming true. "Not because I want to," he added quickly, seeing her expression, "but because my presence here is probably making things worse for you. If people think we're—" He paused, his cheeks coloring slightly. "If they think there's something between us, it might give them more ammunition to use against you." The suggestion hit Clara like a physical blow, even though she knew it made logical sense. Daniel's friendship had become a bright spot in her increasingly dark world, and the thought of facing the growing hostility alone filled her with despair. But she also understood that his reputation in town was probably suffering because of his association with her, and she couldn't bear the thought of pulling him down with her. "You're probably right," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the way her heart was breaking. "I never should have let you get involved in my problems. You have your business to think about, your reputation with other customers in other towns. I can't ask you to risk all of that for me." She turned away, unable to meet his eyes as she spoke the words that felt like tearing out a piece of her soul. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Clara could hear him moving around the cabin, probably gathering his things to leave. She focused on sweeping up the last of the glass fragments, using the physical task to keep herself from falling apart completely. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft she almost didn't hear him. "Do you want me to go?" he asked. "Not because it might be safer or more practical, but because it's what you actually want?" Clara looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because I'll respect your wishes either way, but I need to know if you're sending me away because you think you should, or because you genuinely don't want me here." The question hung in the air between them like a bridge that could either connect them or collapse entirely, depending on how Clara chose to answer. She thought about all the reasons why pushing him away would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing for both of them. But she also thought about the loneliness that had been eating at her heart for weeks, and how much brighter her world had become since Daniel had entered it. "I don't want you to go," she whispered, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. "But I'm scared of what might happen to you if you stay. These people, they're not just angry anymore. They're dangerous, and I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you because of me." Tears she had been holding back for days finally spilled over, and she didn't try to stop them. Daniel crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried out weeks of accumulated fear and frustration. "Then, we'll face it together," he said firmly. "Whatever happens, we'll deal with it as a team. I'm not going anywhere, Clara. Not unless you tell me to leave and mean it." His words were like a warm blanket around her heart, offering comfort she had almost forgotten existed. As they held each other in the morning light streaming through the broken window, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. The fear was still there, along with the uncertainty about what the future might hold, but it was balanced now by something stronger, the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore, that someone believed in her worth enough to stand by her side when the world seemed determined to tear her down. The sound of angry voices drifted through the evening air like smoke from a dangerous fire, growing louder and more distinct as a group of men approached Clara's cabin with the deliberate steps of people who had made up their minds about something terrible. Clara peered through her newly repaired window to see torches bobbing in the darkness, casting dancing shadows on the faces of neighbors she had known for years, but who now looked like strangers bent on destruction. Hayes Morrison led the group, his expensive boots and well-tailored clothes marking him as different from the farmers and shopkeepers who followed in his wake. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and Clara could hear enough of his words to understand that he was whipping the crowd into a frenzy with talk of unnatural influences and protecting our children from evil. Clara's heart raced as she counted at least 12 men in the approaching mob, their faces grim with the kind of righteous anger that made people capable of things they would never consider under normal circumstances. She recognized Tom Fletcher from the hardware store, old Pete Williams, who ran the livery stable, and even young Jimmy Carson, who was barely 18 and had probably been swept up in the excitement without fully understanding what he was participating in. "Clara," Daniel's voice cut through the night as he appeared at her door, breathing hard from running. "I heard them gathering at Morrison's house. They're coming for you, and they're not planning to just talk." He grabbed her arm, his face pale with worry. "We need to get you out of here right now. I have my wagon ready behind the cabin." But Clara pulled away from his grip, her jaw set with determination that surprised even her. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not running away from my own home because a bunch of frightened men have decided to play judge and jury. If they want to accuse me of something, they can do it to my face." She moved to her medicine cabinet and began pulling out her most precious supplies, the rare herbs, the carefully prepared tinctures, and the leather journal that contained decades of healing knowledge. "This isn't about being brave," Daniel said urgently. "This is about staying alive. Mobs like this don't listen to reason, and they're beyond caring about right and wrong. Please, Clara, don't let pride get you killed." He tried again to guide her toward the back door, but she stood her ground like a tree with roots too deep to be moved by any wind. The voices were getting closer now, and Clara could make out individual words that made her stomach clench with fear. "Witch," "devil's work," and "cleanse the town" floated through the air like poison, each phrase stoking the crowd's anger higher. She could see the orange glow of their torches reflected in her windows, and the sight made her think of all the stories she had heard about women who had faced similar accusations in other places and other times. "If I run now," Clara said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins, "I'll be running for the rest of my life. Every time I help someone, every time I use my knowledge to heal instead of harm, there will be whispers and suspicions. I have to make a stand here, Daniel. Not just for me, but for every woman who comes after me." She pressed her grandmother's journal into his hands. "But I need you to take this. Whatever happens to me, this knowledge shouldn't be lost." Daniel stared at the journal, then at Clara's face, and she could see the moment when he realized she wasn't going to be persuaded to leave. "Then I'm staying too," he said, setting the journal down and moving to stand beside her. "If you're going to face this, you won't do it alone." His presence beside her felt like a shield against the approaching storm, and Clara found strength in his solidarity that she hadn't known she possessed. The mob stopped just outside her fence, their torches creating a semicircle of flickering light that turned the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. Hayes Morrison stepped forward, his voice carrying the false authority of someone who had appointed himself spokesman for righteousness. "Clara Hartwell," he called out. "Come out and face the judgment of this community." Clara opened her door and stepped onto her porch, Daniel beside her, and faced the angry crowd with a dignity that seemed to surprise some of them. In the torchlight, she could see uncertainty flickering across several faces, as if some of the men were beginning to question what they were doing. But Morrison's voice rose again, drowning out any second thoughts. "You've bewitched this town long enough," he shouted. "No natural healing works the way yours does. No ordinary woman can snatch children back from death's door like you did with the Donnelly boy. You've made a pact with dark forces, and we won't stand for it any longer." His words were met with murmurs of agreement from some of the crowd, but Clara noticed that others remained silent, their faces troubled. "I saved Billy Donnelly's life with willow bark and elderflower," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly through the night air. "The same herbs my grandmother used, and her grandmother before her. If knowledge passed down through generations of women who cared for the sick is witchcraft, then half the mothers in this town are guilty of the same crime." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I have never harmed anyone in this community. I have delivered your children, tended your wounds, and sat with your dying. If that makes me a witch, then I accept your judgment." The crowd stirred uneasily at her words, and Clara saw doubt creeping into more faces. Morrison seemed to sense that his control over the mob was slipping, and his voice became more desperate as he tried to regain their attention. "Don't be fooled by her clever words," he shouted. "Evil always disguises itself as good. We know what we've seen, and we know what must be done." But Clara wasn't finished. She stepped forward, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I challenge any of you to name a single person I have harmed through my healing. One child I've delivered who wasn't healthy. One wound I've tended that didn't heal properly. One fever I've broken that caused any harm to the patient." She looked directly at several men in the crowd, calling them by name. "Tom Fletcher, when your wife was bleeding after little Sarah's birth, who stayed with her all night to make sure she lived? Pete Williams, when your son broke his arm last spring, who set the bone so straight that he never limped?" A child's scream pierced the night air like a knife through silk, cutting through the tension between Clara and the angry mob as 10-year-old Lucy Parker collapsed in the middle of Main Street, her small body shaking with violent seizures that made her look like a broken doll. The crowd that had gathered to condemn Clara suddenly scattered in panic, parents grabbing their own children and pulling them away from whatever mysterious sickness had struck the sheriff's daughter without warning. "Get the witch!" someone shouted from the back of the crowd, but the voice was immediately drowned out by Sheriff Parker's desperate cry. "Please, someone help her! She's dying!" The big man who had enforced the law in Millbrook for 10 years was on his knees in the dirt, trying to hold his daughter steady, while tears streamed down his weathered face. "I don't care what anyone says about you, Clara. If you can help her, please." Clara didn't hesitate. She pushed through the crowd of men who had come to threaten her, her medical bag already in her hands, as she knelt beside the convulsing child. Lucy's eyes had rolled back in her head, and foam flecked her lips as her body jerked uncontrollably. Clara had seen seizures before, but nothing this severe in a child so young, and she knew that every second counted if Lucy was going to survive. "Everyone back away," Clara commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had taken charge of countless medical emergencies. "She needs air, and your panic isn't helping." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking Lucy's pulse and breathing, while her mind raced through possible causes and treatments. The child's skin was burning hot, and Clara could see the telltale rash spreading across her neck that confirmed her worst fears. "It's measles," Clara announced, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "But it's the worst case I've ever seen. The fever is so high, it's causing the seizures." She looked up at Sheriff Parker, whose face had gone pale with terror. "I need to get her temperature down immediately, or we're going to lose her." The crowd pressed closer, their earlier hostility forgotten in the face of a child's life hanging in the balance. Daniel appeared at Clara's side with a bucket of cool water from the nearest well, anticipating her needs without being asked. "What can I do?" he asked quietly, his calm presence providing an anchor of stability in the chaos. Clara was already mixing a powerful fever reducer in a small cup, her hands steady despite the pressure of working with dozens of eyes watching her every move. "Hold her head still," Clara instructed, spooning the bitter medicine into Lucy's mouth while trying to avoid her thrashing limbs. I know it tastes terrible, sweetheart, but this will help you feel better. She spoke to the unconscious child in the same gentle voice she had used with Billy Donnelly, somehow managing to sound calm and reassuring despite the desperate circumstances. The seizure seemed to last forever, but Clara's experienced hands never stopped working. She applied cool, wet cloths to Lucy's forehead and neck, administered medicine at precise intervals, and monitored every change in the child's condition. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the violent shaking began to subside, and Lucy's breathing became less labored. "Is she going to be all right?" Sheriff Parker asked, his voice cracking with emotion as he watched Clara work. The man who had always seemed so strong and confident now looked fragile and helpless, reduced to a frightened father who would have given anything to trade places with his suffering daughter. "The worst is over," Clara said carefully, not wanting to promise more than she could deliver. "But she's not out of danger yet. Measles can be tricky, especially when it causes seizures like this. She'll need careful watching for the next few days." She looked around at the crowd, many of whom were nodding in approval at her quick response to the emergency. As Clara continued to tend to Lucy, she became aware of the shifting mood in the crowd around her. The men who had come with torches and accusations were now watching her work with something approaching respect, and she could hear whispered conversations that sounded very different from the angry talk that had filled the air just minutes before. "Look how gentle she is with the child," someone murmured. "That's not the touch of someone who serves evil." Others nodded in agreement, and Clara realized that her actions in this moment were speaking louder than any words could have. She wasn't just treating Lucy's illness. She was demonstrating the true nature of her calling to people who had never seen her work before. "She saved my Billy," Margaret Donnelly said, her voice carrying clearly through the crowd. "When Doc Morrison was gone and I thought we were going to lose him, Clara brought him back from the edge of death. She sat with him for 3 days and nights, never leaving his side." Other voices began to join hers, sharing stories of Clara's help during difficult births, her treatment of infected wounds, and her gentle care of the elderly. Lucy's breathing steadied, and her eyes fluttered open for the first time since the seizure had begun. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice weak but clear. Sheriff Parker sobbed with relief as he gathered his daughter into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you," he said to Clara, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done if—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood. She had seen that same look of grateful disbelief on many faces over the years, and it never failed to remind her why she had chosen this difficult path. As the crowd began to disperse, Clara noticed that many of the men who had come to threaten her were now avoiding eye contact, their faces showing embarrassment at their earlier behavior. Hayes Morrison had disappeared entirely, probably realizing that his campaign against Clara had lost its momentum in the face of her obvious skill and compassion. "I think we should get Lucy home," Clara said, helping Sheriff Parker lift his daughter. "She needs rest and quiet, and I'll need to check on her several times over the next few days. But I believe she's going to make a full recovery." The relief on the man's face was worth more than any payment Clara had ever received. As they walked toward the Parker house, Daniel fell into step beside Clara, his presence both comforting and reassuring. "You were incredible back there," he said softly. "I've never seen anyone work under pressure like that." Clara felt a flush of pride at his words, but she was too exhausted to fully appreciate the compliment. "It's what I do," she said simply. "It's what I've always done. I just wish it hadn't taken another child's life, being in danger for some people, to remember that." She looked back at the street where the confrontation had taken place, seeing the scattered torches that had been dropped and forgotten when Lucy collapsed. "I wonder if this changes anything, or if they'll go back to calling me a witch as soon as they stop being grateful." The morning sun painted Millbrook's main street in shades of gold and possibility as Clara walked to Henderson's general store, her head held high despite the nervous flutter in her stomach that reminded her of the previous night's drama. 3 days had passed since Lucy Parker's seizure, and the 10-year-old was making a remarkable recovery that had become the talk of the entire town, though whether that talk would work in Clara's favor remained to be seen. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her inventory ledger as Clara entered the store, and for a moment, the older woman's face showed the same uncertainty that had marked most of Clara's interactions with townspeople for weeks. Then, as if making a deliberate decision, she smiled and set down her pen to give Clara her full attention. "Clara, dear," she said warmly, "I heard about what you did for little Lucy Parker. Tom Fletcher was just in here telling everyone how you saved that child's life right there in the street." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "He said you worked like an angel, calm and sure even with all those men standing around making noise. Said he's never seen anything like it." Clara felt her shoulders relax slightly, though she remained cautious about reading too much into one person's change of heart. "I'm just glad Lucy is feeling better," she said simply. "Children are resilient. They bounce back from serious illness faster than adults do." She moved toward the shelves, looking for supplies she needed to replenish her medical kit after the recent emergency. "Speaking of bouncing back," Mrs. Henderson continued, following Clara through the store, "Billy Donnelly was in here yesterday with his mother, bright as a button and full of energy. Margaret couldn't stop talking about how grateful she is for everything you did for her family." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "I have to say, Clara, I'm ashamed of how some folks in this town have been treating you lately. Fear makes people do foolish things sometimes." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the store's bell jingling as the door opened to admit Sheriff Parker, his face showing the strain of 3 sleepless nights spent watching over his daughter. Clara tensed, unsure whether his presence meant more trouble or simply a father's need to update the person who had saved his child's life. "Clara," he said, removing his hat and approaching her with the careful politeness of someone who owed a debt he could never repay, "I wanted to thank you again for what you did for Lucy. Doc Morrison came back from the Hendricks place this morning and said you handled everything exactly right. Said he couldn't have done better himself." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. "I also wanted to apologize for not stopping that mob the other night. I should have been protecting you instead of letting fear and ignorance rule my town." Clara studied the sheriff's face, seeing genuine remorse in his eyes, along with the exhaustion that came from caring for a sick child. "How is Lucy today?" she asked, deflecting his apology, because she wasn't ready to discuss the events of 3 nights ago. "Is she keeping food down? Any signs of the rash spreading?" "She's much better," Sheriff Parker said, his face lighting up with relief. "Ate a full breakfast this morning and even asked if she could go outside to play. I told her she needs a few more days of rest, but it's good to see her acting like herself again." He paused, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Doc Morrison wants to talk to you about her treatment. Said he'd like to learn more about the medicines you used." The news that the town's official doctor wanted to consult with her felt like a small victory. But Clara knew that one man's approval wouldn't necessarily change the minds of those who had been spreading rumors about her methods. Still, it was progress, and she decided to focus on that rather than dwelling on the hostility that might still be lurking beneath the surface. "I'd be happy to discuss Lucy's case with Dr. Morrison," Clara said. "Medical knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. If something I learned from my grandmother can help him treat other patients, then everyone benefits." She selected a bottle of willow bark extract from the shelf, noting that Mrs. Henderson was listening to their conversation with obvious interest. As Clara continued her shopping, she became aware of other customers entering the store, their voices creating a background hum of conversation that seemed different from the whispered suspicions that had followed her for weeks. Tom Fletcher nodded respectfully when he saw her, and old Pete Williams actually tipped his hat in greeting. Even young Jimmy Carson, who had been part of the mob 3 nights earlier, looked embarrassed when their eyes met. "Looks like the tide is turning," Daniel said quietly, appearing at her elbow with his own basket of supplies. Clara hadn't heard him enter the store, but his presence beside her felt natural and comforting. "I've been listening to conversations around town, and people are starting to remember all the times you've helped them instead of focusing on their fears." Clara wanted to share his optimism, but she had lived through enough small-town dynamics to know that public opinion could shift again just as quickly as it had changed in her favor. "People have short memories," she said softly. "Today they're grateful because Lucy is alive, but tomorrow they might start worrying again about how I managed to save her. Fear runs deeper than gratitude sometimes. Maybe, Daniel agreed, but you've given them something concrete to hold on to now. They've seen you work under pressure, seen your skill and compassion up close. That's harder to dismiss than rumors and suspicions. He selected a bag of coffee beans from the shelf, his movements casual but his attention focused on Clara's face. Besides, you're not facing this alone anymore. There are people in this town who remember what you've done for them, and they're starting to speak up. As if to prove his point, Margaret Donnelly entered the store with Billy in tow, the boy's healthy color and bright eyes serving as a living testament to Clara's healing abilities. When Billy saw Clara, he broke free from his mother's hand and ran to her, wrapping his small arms around her legs in an enthusiastic hug that made several other customers smile. "Miss Clara!" he exclaimed, his voice clear and strong. "Mama says you made me better when I was sick. She says you're a hero." His innocent words carried more weight than any adult's testimony could have, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she knelt down to return his embrace. "You made yourself better, Billy," she said gently. "I just helped a little bit. Your body did all the hard work of fighting off the sickness." But even as she spoke, Clara could see the impact of the child's words on the other people in the store. Children didn't lie about things like this, and Billy's obvious health and happiness were impossible to argue with. As Clara completed her purchases and prepared to leave, she noticed that the atmosphere in the store had shifted noticeably from when she had first entered. Conversations seemed more natural, people made eye contact more readily, and the undercurrent of tension that had marked her recent public appearances seemed to have lessened. It wasn't complete acceptance yet, but it was a beginning, and Clara allowed herself to hope that the worst of her troubles might be behind her. The leather-bound journal fell open on Clara's kitchen table with a soft thud, its yellowed pages revealing decades of carefully recorded healing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who refused to let fear silence their calling. Clara traced her finger along her grandmother's faded handwriting, remembering the old woman's weathered hands, teaching her to identify plants by touch and smell when she was barely tall enough to reach the herb garden. "I want to show you something," Clara said to Daniel, who sat across from her drinking coffee while morning light streamed through her newly repaired window. "Something that might help people understand that what I do isn't magic or witchcraft. It's science that's been tested and proven over hundreds of years." She turned the journal toward him, revealing detailed sketches of plants alongside notes about their properties and uses. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes widening as he took in the meticulous documentation that filled every page. "This is incredible," he breathed, studying a drawing of willow bark that showed not just the plant's appearance but also detailed instructions for preparing it as a fever reducer. "Your grandmother was a true scientist, recording her observations and results like any doctor would." He looked up at Clara with newfound respect. This journal could change everything. People need to see this. Clara felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach as she considered Daniel's suggestion. The journal contained some of her most precious memories of her grandmother, along with family secrets that had been closely guarded for generations. But she also knew that the written proof of her method's scientific foundation might be the only thing that could convince skeptics that her healing abilities came from knowledge rather than supernatural forces. "I've been thinking about what you said," Clara continued, turning to a page filled with detailed notes about treating childhood fevers, about how important it is to share knowledge instead of hiding it. "Maybe it's time to stop being so secretive about what I do and start teaching others." The idea both excited and terrified her, but she knew that keeping her skills hidden only fed the suspicions that had nearly destroyed her life. Their conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the door, and Clara's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the frantic rhythm that usually meant someone needed immediate medical help. She opened the door to find Dr. Morrison standing on her threshold, his usually neat appearance disheveled, and his face creased with worry that made him look older than his 45 years. "Clara," he said, slightly out of breath, from what appeared to be a hurried journey, "I need your help. There's been an accident at the Morrison Ranch. A beam fell and crushed young Jake Morrison's leg. Hayes sent me to get you because He says you're the only one who might be able to save it. The irony wasn't lost on Clara, that Hayes Morrison, who had led the mob against her just days earlier, was now asking for her help when his own son was in danger. Clara was already reaching for her medical bag before Dr. Morrison finished speaking, her personal feelings about Hayes Morrison forgotten in the face of an injured child who needed her skills. "How bad is it?" she asked, checking to make sure she had everything she might need for treating a serious crush injury. "Is he conscious? Any signs of bleeding?" "Conscious, but in terrible pain," Dr. Morrison replied, holding Clara's door open as she gathered supplies. "The leg is clearly broken, probably in multiple places, and there's some bleeding but not as much as I feared. The main concern is that we might not be able to save the leg at all." His voice carried the weight of a doctor who had seen too many cases where amputation was the only option. Daniel appeared at Clara's side, with a fresh horse already saddled, anticipating her need for fast transportation to the Morrison ranch. "I'll drive you," he said simply, helping her secure her medical bag to the saddle. "You'll need someone to assist you. And I've watched you work enough to be useful." Clara felt a rush of gratitude for his support, knowing that his presence would help her focus on the medical emergency, rather than the social complications of treating her former enemy's son. The ride to the Morrison ranch passed in tense silence, with Clara's mind already working through the challenges of treating a severe crush injury with limited supplies. She knew that saving Jake's leg would require all of her skills, plus some techniques she had only read about in her grandmother's journal. The irony that Hayes Morrison's hatred of her might now be the only thing standing between his son and permanent disability wasn't lost on her. When they arrived at the ranch, Clara was struck by the scene of controlled chaos that greeted them. Ranch hands stood in worried clusters, while Hayes Morrison paced back and forth outside the barn where his son was trapped, his usual arrogance replaced by the raw fear of a father watching his child suffer. When he saw Clara, his face showed a mixture of relief and shame that made Clara realize how much this emergency had cost his pride. "Thank you for coming," he said stiffly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have no right to ask for your help after what happened the other night. But Jake is my only son, and if there's any chance you can save his leg." He couldn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood. Parental love had a way of cutting through prejudice and fear when a child's life was at stake. Clara entered the barn to find Jake Morrison pinned beneath a heavy wooden beam, his face pale with pain and shock but his eyes alert and focused. The 16-year-old was trying to be brave, but Clara could see the fear in his expression as he looked at his trapped leg. She knelt beside him, her voice gentle and reassuring, as she began her initial examination. "Hello, Jake," she said softly. "I'm going to take a look at your leg and see what we're dealing with. It's going to hurt when I touch it, but I need to understand how badly you're injured before I can help you." She could feel the boy's muscles tense with anxiety, but he nodded bravely, trusting her to do whatever was necessary. The examination revealed damage that was serious, but not hopeless. The leg was broken in at least 2 places, and there was significant swelling and bruising, but Clara's experienced hands detected no signs of the kind of crushing damage that would make amputation necessary. She looked up at Dr. Morrison, who had been watching her work with professional interest. "It's bad, but we can save it," she said firmly. "The bones are broken, but they're clean breaks that should heal well if we set them properly. The main challenge will be getting him out from under this beam without causing more damage." She stood up, her mind already formulating a plan that would require careful coordination between everyone present. "What do you need from us?" Hayes Morrison asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Clara looked at the man who had tried to drive her from town, seeing not an enemy but a desperate father who would do anything to help his son. In that moment, she realized that healing was about more than just treating injuries. It was about building bridges between people who had allowed fear to divide them. The heavy wooden beam groaned like a living thing as 6 ranch hands strained against its weight, their faces red with effort as they fought to lift the massive timber that had Jake Morrison pinned to the barn floor. Clara knelt beside the injured boy, her hands steady despite the pressure of knowing that one wrong move could turn a treatable injury into a permanent disability that would change his life forever. "On my count," Clara said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had taken charge of countless medical emergencies. "When I say now, you lift the beam just enough for me to pull Jake clear. Don't lift it any higher than necessary. We don't want it to slip and fall again." The men nodded, their muscles bunched with tension as they prepared to coordinate their efforts with Clara's rescue attempt. Clara positioned herself to grab Jake under his arms, avoiding his injured leg while preparing to drag him to safety as quickly as possible. "Jake, I need you to help me by staying as relaxed as you can," she said to the boy, whose face was gray with pain but whose eyes remained focused on her voice. "Don't try to move your leg at all. Just let me do the work. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, ma'am," Jake whispered, his voice strained but determined. Clara could see the Morrison family's stubbornness in his expression. The same iron will that had made his father such a formidable opponent, now serving to help the boy endure his ordeal. She caught Daniel's eye, and he moved into position to help support Jake's injured leg during the extraction. "Now," Clara commanded, and the ranch hands lifted with coordinated effort that spoke of years working together. Clara pulled Jake backward as smoothly as she could, while Daniel carefully guided the injured leg to prevent it from twisting or bending. The entire operation took less than 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone involved. Once Jake was clear of the beam, Clara immediately began a more thorough examination of his injuries. The leg was clearly broken in multiple places, and the swelling had increased significantly during the time he had been pinned. But Clara's experienced hands found no signs of the crushing damage she had feared, and she allowed herself a small moment of relief before beginning the delicate work of setting the broken bones. "Dr. Morrison, I'm going to need your help with this," Clara said, looking up at the town's official physician. "The breaks are complex, and it will take both of us working together to align everything properly." She was pleased to see respect rather than resentment in the older man's eyes as he knelt beside her, ready to follow her lead in treating the injury. Working together, Clara and Dr. Morrison carefully manipulated Jake's leg, feeling for the correct alignment of broken bone fragments, while the boy gritted his teeth against the pain. Clara's knowledge of anatomy, gained from years of practical experience, combined with Dr. Morrison's formal medical training, to create a partnership that neither could have achieved alone. "There," Clara said finally, as she felt the last bone fragment click into proper position. "Now we need to immobilize it completely while the bones heal. Jake, you're going to be on crutches for at least 2 months, but if you follow my instructions exactly, your leg should heal completely." The relief on Hayes Morrison's face was visible from across the barn. As Clara worked to create a proper splint from boards and bandages, she became aware of the crowd that had gathered to watch the rescue. Ranch hands, neighbors, and even some townspeople had arrived after hearing about the accident, and they were all observing her work with a mixture of fascination and respect that felt very different from the suspicion she had grown accustomed to. "I've never seen anything like it," one of the ranch hands murmured to his companion. She worked like she could see right through the skin to the bones underneath. And the way she took charge of the whole situation, like she's been doing this kind of thing her whole life. Clara pretended not to hear, but the words warmed her heart more than any formal praise could have. Hayes Morrison approached Clara as she finished securing Jake's splint, his face showing emotions that she had never seen from him before: gratitude, respect, and something that might have been shame. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "And more than that, I owe you a debt I can never repay. You saved my son's leg, maybe his whole future, and you did it after I—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood. "You don't owe me anything," Clara said simply. "I'm a healer. When someone is hurt, I help them. That's what I do, regardless of who they are or what they've done." She looked at Jake, who was now resting comfortably with his leg properly immobilized. "Your son is going to be fine, Mr. Morrison. The bones will heal strong, and he'll be able to work and ride and do everything he did before." As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself surrounded by people who wanted to thank her for her skill and courage. Dr. Morrison publicly praised her knowledge and technique. Several ranch hands asked questions about her methods, and even some of the townspeople who had been avoiding her began to approach with tentative friendliness. "You've done something remarkable here," Dr. Morrison said as they prepared to leave the ranch. "Not just medically, but socially. People are seeing you differently now, not as someone to fear, but as someone to respect and value." He paused, looking thoughtful. "I'd like to propose something. Would you be willing to work with me officially, as a partner in treating the medical needs of this community?" Clara felt her heart skip a beat at the unexpected offer. Official recognition from the town's established doctor would change everything about her position in Millbrook, transforming her from a suspected witch into a respected medical professional. "I'd be honored," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As they rode back to town, Clara reflected on how quickly her circumstances had changed. Just days ago, she had faced a mob that wanted to drive her away, and now she was being offered a medical partnership that would secure her place in the community. The irony that it had taken Hayes Morrison's son being injured to complete her transformation from outcast to respected healer wasn't lost on her. "People are going to remember this day," Daniel said, riding beside her as they approached Millbrook. "They'll remember how you put aside personal grudges to help someone who had treated you badly. That's the kind of character that builds real respect, not just fear or suspicion." Clara nodded, feeling a sense of peace that had been missing from her life for weeks. As they entered the town limits, Clara noticed that people were coming out of their houses and shops to watch them pass, their faces showing curiosity rather than hostility. Word of Jake Morrison's accident and her successful treatment had obviously spread quickly, and Clara realized that her reputation in Millbrook was about to undergo a fundamental transformation that would affect every aspect of her future life.